What's going on, Hot Take of the Day listeners? DRW here. Before we start the show, I want to start with a thank you to one of the friends of the show and take a quick minute to introduce API Control Systems, who specializes in control panel fabrication, skid packaged automation, and instrumentation and electrical installations for the oil and gas industry as well as other industries. During a recent show with well-known CEO, he said that when companies try to do too many things, it's very rare that they're successful. And in the words of Mr. Chris Wright, if you're going to be really good at something, you better be deeply focused on it. Well, for over 3 decades, API has been focused on building control panels such as PLC panels for compressor stations, hydraulic well control systems, drilling choke consoles, and skid packaged automation such as hydraulic power and chemical injection skids for deep water projects, and safely installing them. As you know, my sign off, be safe, be good. Safety is always first. Whether electronic, hydraulic, pneumatic, they have the expertise and enthusiasm with their hardworking team. API has a great culture and a lot of longtime employees. They're responsive and they partner with a wide variety of companies from the super majors down to local municipalities. Last year, 2 longtime employees acquired the company, having started there at entry-level positions over 20 years ago, which is a cool example of patience, perseverance, and the American dream. If you want to learn more about API, please go to apicontrolsystems.com and consider giving this fun team a shot at your next panel fabrication or I&E installation project. They're based in Louisiana, they're ready to travel, and again, their website is apicontrolsystems.com. Contact information is there, and when you ask for them, ask for Lucas Como and tell him you want the Hot Take of the Day DRW discount. Thanks for listening. Now on with our show. What is going on, Hot Take Nation? It is DRW here for another episode of the Hot Take of the Day podcast. And today I'm being joined by Ivor Cummins, who some of you may know from his book, which is Eat Rich, Live Well. Did I say that right?
Oh, Eat Rich, Live Long.
Eat Rich, Live Long, which is better than living well. He's on Twitter as the Fat Emperor, which I wanted to get his take on, and has been a silent, not a silent voice, but a thoughtful voice in the COVID crisis, really going back throughout 2020. So Ivor, first of all, thank you for joining us from Dublin, our first international guest.
No, thanks a lot, David. Happy to do so.
So let's start with, I'm curious, where did the Fat Emperor handle come from? What was the thinking behind that one?
Yeah, well, it was kind of a triple layer metaphor. It sounds fancy, but I just thought of it one night because I've been working on metabolic research. I'm a biochemical engineer and kind of a corporate complex problem solving expert. But I had delved into metabolic science after I got poor blood tests myself. And I had 3 doctors in a row, including a professor of medicine who couldn't give me answers on the 2 key questions. You know, what's the implications and what are the root causes that I can start addressing to fix these bad blood markers? So I got frustrated, did the research. Long story short, I found out it was carbohydrate excess that was driving most of it, and I fixed it. But it occurred to me as I went through my research that corporate and kind of food industry and many others have funded science to keep us fearing fat and cholesterol and not to worry too much about carbohydrate. So the Fat Emperor, long story short, was the emperor's new clothes, because a lot of researchers I knew the truth, but they couldn't speak up. So just that fable. And then there's the emperor being the corporate power is the other slice. And then the other was the poor fat kind of emperor, the poor guy who's diabetic, obese, and he doesn't realize it's all to do with the misinformation. Mostly he's been given, and he's got trapped in the cycle of hunger and further obesity because he's eating the wrong foods rather than not doing enough exercise in many cases. So that was it.
So it's interesting because you talk about a narrative, and narrative has been really key in 2020. obviously, where there's a narrative that's carbohydrates are good, but fat and cholesterol are bad. Don't worry, we have a cholesterol medicine that you can take and you'll do great. Or we have all these things, and it's a mainstream narrative is pushed, and it doesn't matter whether you talk about climate change, or in this particular case, food, or in the current case that all of us have to live with all day, every day, COVID. So I'm curious how your pivot from seeing the data and doing the research, how do you become an outspoken, I think critic is a fair word, of the current policy around coronavirus and government responses?
Yeah, so, well, the pivot is it's all metabolic and it's all integration of data, biochemistry, metabolic processes, of which the immune system is one. Um, and when Corona came along, I had spent, I don't know, 6 or 7 years out there lecturing on metabolic science, fat, carbohydrate, cholesterol, autoimmune, and the book and everything to get the message out on how people could fix themselves. So we've had massive success with people fixing themselves. Books don't make money, but great success in the testimonials. And then COVID came along, and the problem, at first I didn't take a whole lot of notice. So my wife was getting concerned. She was going to go and get masks. This was back in March. And I had had a look at the Diamond Princess data, the cruise ship, and the Chinese data. I know you can't fully trust that, but I had a look and I figured, okay, this is going to be a pretty severe flu-like hit in Europe. It's going to be nasty. But I didn't find it something to worry about because the age profile, it was so massively stacked towards the aged and the immunocompromised, etc. So I wasn't personally worried. Not that I didn't care. I wasn't personally worried. So I explained that to her and, all right, okay. And then suddenly, the end of March, lockdowns began to happen after the Italian footage. And these lockdowns I found a bit surprising because I wondered why they didn't follow the WHO 2019 guidelines for pandemic, which was certainly not lockdowns. It's very clear. But they all wanted to do lockdowns, and I figured it was kind of fear. And the Imperial College London came out with these, quite frankly, absurd projections of deaths, which I knew at a glance were out by a factor of 10 to 12. But I figured, okay, the modeling guys have gone crazy. Italy got a really hard hit, a lot of fear, so I could understand it. But when we got into April, because I kind of knew that it's going to go through a pretty severe hit seasonally, and then it's going to tail off coming into April, May, and pretty much fade away in the summer. So I figured it'd all come back out again. But I increasingly got engaged with it because it was clear they did not want to come back down from lockdowns. And I knew then there's something really wrong going on. And then I kept at it. And then in the middle of the summer, for a seasonal virus, which was clear as day it's seasonal. I mean, it disappeared in Europe all summer, and now it's back again in the winter resurgence. They brought in mandatory masks for everyone with prison sentences and fines in the middle of the summer when the hospitals were empty. It was around 2.5 to 3 months away from the winter increase. And there was no exit strategy because if you bring in masks then, when do you bring them out? It just made so little sense. I just got really worried about the atrocious unscientific thinking that was becoming policy. And also I have 5 children, and the world was heading into a bizarre place that 6 months ago I'd never believed we could ever possibly be heading towards. So, and I think the next generation, and it just shocked me. So I became quite fixated.
So I have as well, and a big reason that I became fixated was because of the lockdowns and the slowdown in the economy. Obviously, being an oil and gas energy expert, global oil demand went from 100 million barrels a day to 65. That occurred over a 45-day period, which meant that there was almost 1.5 billion barrels that were produced and put in storage and tankers and swimming pools that was going to leak back to the market over the next 500 days and depress oil prices, which was going to have a very disproportionate effect on oil companies. And so I too was looking at the data, and it's funny that you talk about the Diamond Princess, because a lot of people say, well, we didn't know anything about the early data. And I always pointed to the Diamond Princess. Since you have looked extensively at the Diamond Princess, I will have you tell us what you saw about it and what was so interesting and how you took that data and extended it over everything else we've seen since March.
Right. Well, there was let's put it in three. So there's the Chinese data that showed the 10 times risk factor for age, COPD, which is insulin resistance mostly, heart disease, which is insulin resistance mostly. So it's very clear from China, it's massively stacked towards aged insulin resistant. So that put it in the kind of box. And approximately you could guess the impact in percentage mortality. The Diamond Princess, then, there were a few deaths out of the thousands. I can't remember exactly, but maybe a 0.7% IFR or fatality rate in a Petri dish. And they were much older people, and kind of Americans or whoever. So they wouldn't be amazingly metabolically healthy, and they were older. So that kind of bracketed it as well. And then in Italy, we saw the massive age profile when Italy got hit. 98.6% of them had comorbidities, and the average age from memory was kind of around the life expectancy or higher.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you could kind of tell the nature of the issue, roughly, and it was like a very severe flu, perhaps. So that was it. And one other thing I'll mention, it was a little later, Professor Michael Levitt, the Nobel Prize winner, I interviewed him on Zoom way back. And I also went to London for our new coronavirus movie, and I interviewed him with a team there. And he had seen it in February himself from Diamond Princess and the Chinese data, but he'd also seen that the curve had curled over and lockdown didn't affect it, that mathematically it had a life of its own. And that's what turned out to be the case. Lockdown has minimal effect. And he had contacted Imperial College, and he had to use 2 more Nobel Prize winners to force them to reply to him. And he explained to them mathematically, pretty simply actually, that they were out by a factor of 10 to 12 on their projections. Like if they're out by 20%, he wouldn't bother contacting them, but 10 to 12. And they just brushed them aside. They just didn't want to know. So all of that was going on at the time, but you're right, the data was there, plenty of data to make a call. And you know what? Even if you saw that data and you said, yeah, but, just in case, you could do a lockdown for a couple of weeks to flatten the curve. And they did say 3 weeks to flatten the curve. That's it. So what happened after 3 weeks? Well, the curve turned over on its own, because in UK, the lockdown came after the curl over, and Italy, lockdown came after the curl over, and Germany, etc. But when the curve came down, why didn't the lockdown just get taken out pretty quickly and then whew?
So what do you make of that? Because again, I mean, it's easy to be scared as a politician who has to be reelected. And they see this crazy model. They pick the worst possible model, the Imperial College. 2.2 million Americans were going to die, and they reacted. They come up with a policy, and now 8 months later, we're still in the policy. Why do you think that there has been no public discourse? I mean, you've been on the BBC amongst many other places talking about this and raising awareness, but I'm sure you get a lot of hate. You're not an epidemiologist, Ivor. You can't say this. What are you doing? Trust the doctors. How do you integrate that in terms of why this policy response has been this way and maintained this way?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, to be honest. So, but in terms of you're not an epidemiologist, that's so absurd, because the epidemiologists are a one-trick pony. I used to manage large technical teams around the world, and I'd have various specialties, but you can never really fully trust them with managing a big, complex interactional problem. You just can't do it, because it's a rare breed that can integrate all the technologies into a whole picture. So the specialists are great for their little corner, and they can go really deep. But what I always needed was depth in each individual area and breadth, because that's what solves problems and gets correct solutions. So the doctors I know, they all make the point that everyone's saying you're not a doctor, and doctors are the worst people really to solve a problem like this. They're great for treating the illness, right? That's one particular focus. But in terms of integrating massive data and complexity and ambiguity, it's not going to happen. So the epidemiologists are always rewarded for being much higher than what's going to happen. And if they come up with a projection slightly lower than what happens, they get in trouble. So they're biased massively to predict doom. So that's just on that, on the specialty. And the other question was, why is it happening? Now, that's a tricky one because you got this conspiracy theory slur that gets thrown if you actually do the equivalent of investigative journalism. So 30 years ago, an investigative journalist, nowadays they'd be screamed at as a conspiracy theorist. So Watergate even, nowadays it'd be fake news. The tapes weren't real. So people need to remember that conspiracy theorist is a weaponized word now, and it stops people simply analyzing root causes and facts and biases and conflicts. It's all a conspiracy theory. But I would say I have a thought experiment. So this is one way of saying it. If I went back in time to March and I magically made the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, WEF, and a few other bodies, international bodies, which have a lot of conflicts, if I just made them quiet, none of this would have happened. So what we said earlier, there might have been some lockdown stuff, panic, extra beds, but by April or May, the fear would have fallen away and the measures would have fallen away and people would have heaved a sigh of relief and then had a whole summer normal until in the winter there'd be some concerns, this thing's back again, So that one thought experiment. So you can kind of say that that's a major factor are those organizations. And I'd have to say the WHO, I know you get censored for talking against them, but the reality is their 2019 guidelines, and I can send you a link, are very clear on a couple of things. Very clear. Their 2019 guidelines, decades of science and pandemic management expertise in these, November 2019. So they say on track and trace, once a virus broadly enters a country, there is no real value in track and trace. The evidence base is clearly so weak. The impact, cost benefit, no, not recommended. So that's one thing. People might be surprised at. And the second thing they had was quarantine of exposed individuals. People who are sick and symptomatic, they say stay at home. Yeah, of course. But quarantine of exposed individuals who are exposed to a case is not recommended. Now, they didn't even cover quarantining whole countries because it wouldn't have occurred to them in November to even say anything because that's so stupid that they didn't even cover it. But they didn't even recommend in quarantine for exposed individuals once a virus was present significantly in a country or in an area. And we know back in March, not only was it present, it was all over the place, right?
Right. I mean, yeah, and you could use the science and the math, which again, I'm a math guy, and so the number I recall, there's 450 NBA basketball players who were being tested at a time when we didn't have tests and we couldn't get tests. 14 of them had it, which if you extrapolate that across the American population in early March, 10 million people already had this thing. The Diamond Princess was 3,700 people on the ship. 700 got infected, and they were floating around the ocean like a petri dish with no filtration, no real awareness, no masks, and yet only 20% of the ship got sick, 1% died, age adjusted, all that. I mean, it seemed so crazy, and then Boris Johnson got sick. I remember that being kind of a bit of a demarcation. Boris Johnson had been pushing back on the narrative, had been going the Swedish route, and was like, we're not going to lock down the UK. The imperial model came out. There was a lot of pressure, went into lockdown, and then he got the coronavirus. So I'm curious because the news coming out this weekend was that Boris Johnson may have been exposed again. And so he's gone into quarantine, which seems bizarre because if you were exposed in March, shouldn't you be immune now?
Well, I hadn't heard that one actually, so that strikes me as theatre. But they were mining for months and months all over the world trying to find reinfections because that would help make people scared, which seems to be the goal of everything. So they've got 5 or 6 cases of the tens or hundreds of millions of cases over the last 3 or 4 months, and they've made huge media out of each one, but 5. So reinfection can exist. It can happen. I mean, with a cold sore, it keeps coming back again and again when your immune system's down. Can happen. But it's irrelevant to this conversation. So I'm not sure what's going on with Boris, but it looks like a bit of propaganda, I would guess, because the data at the high level in the science says tiny amounts, and overwhelmingly when someone has a reinfection, it's either a different strain, and in any case, they're asymptomatic. So the second, like being immune or de facto immune doesn't mean you cannot get it. It means that there's no real effect. So a huge proportion of people, when this new virus came in, around 80%, like the Diamond Princess, but in all the studies, around 80% of people fully exposed indoors even with a symptomatic case, nothing happens to them. So we kind of had 80% de facto effective immunity in the population, even though this was new, because it shares so many proteins with prior coronaviruses. I mean, evolution is not an idiot. We can recognize scores of proteins from that family. This one is just slightly different in a few aspects. So of course we recognize it. Many published papers on this. So I guess, I don't know, those kinds of stories, it's like, okay, let's suppress science and let's always focus on using theater. I mean, that's the way it's looked to me for 6 months.
So one of the things you said earlier was, how do we come out of this? And that, to me, to be intellectually honest, I really struggle, because I am exactly like you. In the summer, when the hospitals were open and empty, and notwithstanding that you're going to have a curve like the flu, and I'm not comparing it to the flu, I'm just saying like the flu, but it's going to start in September, it's going to surge in January, February, and it's going to fade away. And sure, are there cases in the summer? There was a spike in the United States during July, so clearly. But the hospitals were open and empty, and it seemed like if we wanted to get to herd immunity, locking down young people under 50 and not having restaurants fully open, and not having schools fully open, and not having all the low-risk people out in the world getting it would have been beneficial, because we'd be more prepared for now. Now we're going into a winter, we're seeing a surge, as we would see in the flu. There's masks and social distancing implemented all around the world, and yet we're still seeing surges. What is the way out of this? I mean, is the world going to mandate masks forever? Are people going to rise up and say, this is not what I signed up for with my politicians? I mean, in the UK, and from your perspective, what comes out of this? How do we get back to any semblance of normal?
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly, again, not getting into conspiracy, but I knew in the middle of the summer, when the masks came out of left field, out of nowhere, in the most profound act of anti-science in my lifetime, and I'm 30 years upholding science, logic, problem solving, technical. I was born for it. In my lifetime, that is the single most profound bit of anti-science, to bring in masks in the middle of the summer. And I just knew that can't happen unless there's some desires that are not to do with health. It can't. No one's that stupid, So I reckon one way is to overcome whatever desires or strategies or objectives by organizations are to keep this thing going with as much hysteria as possible. In Europe, they kept it going with masks, and then they got finally to their desired winter. Now, I won't say who they are, but there was clearly a strategy that we need to get to the winter for this seasonal virus. We'll have a bit more hospital action then, and then we can keep going. What's the extra strategy for this force that's driving this thing? I guess when the vaccine comes, they'll say, well, here's a vaccine. And even though it's gone through its epidemic phase in Europe and mostly in America, though interestingly, I'll say one little sidebar. America, the prior flu epidemics, they have a double hump. You get a hump in the Northeast, and then you get a summer a steadier hump in the south, because the south behaves like Mexico or like Brazil. It's different seasonality, regionality. So this matches that perfectly. If you look at the coronavirus, it's the exact same double hump as the prior influenza epidemics. Not many people know that. There's nothing new in this, really. But I get back to point. So how do you get out of it? You know, if there are people who want to keep it going until a vaccine, well, you try and overcome those people, or you protest, or you share the science and say this makes no sense. I think at this stage it's populist kind of appreciation of the reality and then pushing back on this stuff. I don't know what leader is going to do it, because the leaders have obviously failed catastrophically in their management of this.
So when you talk about the anti-science of masks, I'm curious, the most common, I have been anti-mask. I'm totally fine if someone else wants to wear a mask. And in particular, if you're wearing an N95 mask, which seems to me a good choice, I will take precautions to take extra distance from you. I'm curious when people say, well, I need you to wear a mask. You're wearing your mask for me, and I'm wearing my mask for you. Why is it so hard, Ivor? Why wouldn't you just wear a mask, do what they say, just put it on your face, and just like be one with society? Why are you pushing back on it? And I'm not saying you are pushing back on it, but how do you balance the it's just not that big a deal, Ivor, David, just put it on?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because I've given up on the anti kind of mask policy thing, because it was a creature of the summer. There's no point even talking about it now that the normal winter resurgence is happening. But during the summer, that was the main conversation. And the reason is because you have to have principles. I mean, people seem to have forgotten about principles. So it's just a mask. Well, my country's government just came in a profoundly unscientific way with no evidence whatsoever, overturned 4 decades of published evidence that has concurred that for influenza and for viral nanometer virus transmission, they're pretty much useless. Overturned that, but not only asked me to wear one for you or for whoever, it doesn't matter. They brought in prison sentences and fines. So there's a principle there that's, you wouldn't say worth dying for, but the problem is it's a slippery slope. If governments bring in mandatory things and ask you to wear a mask or walk barefoot, they'd better have some science if they're going to make it mandatory, and they didn't. So if you let that go, where does it go? Where does this go? The other thing is, like I said, the exit strategy. So they brought in something without the support of evidence-based medicine, evidence and science. They made it mandatory, and there was no exit strategy. So basically what we were being told was, we're doing all of this without the science, we're making it mandatory, we're telling you you will do it under pain of fines, and we're kind of going to do it to you forever. Now, if people don't reject that, what's happened to us? What's happened to us? And if it was bubonic plague, if we had an infectional fatality rate that was way, way higher than influenza, huge, and if we were overrun in the summer in our hospitals, you might say, look, it's extreme circumstances, guys. We shouldn't be doing this really, but look out there. But when you looked out there in the summer, there was nothing happening at all. It makes no sense. It just, you can't let that go. If you let that go, where are we going? Where's it heading? And I think we know where it's heading now, pretty much.
And when you say that, again, you get shouted down as a conspiracy theorist or an individualist instead of the collective good. And when you draw historical comparisons around when rights have been taken away by government, there's not a lot of good cases that you can quote. It's shocking. Now, let's talk a little bit about your book in the context of this, and your public persona and everything you've built towards. You are going anti-populist in a view of COVID, where some who aren't looking at the numbers are terrified. The media certainly is shouting at you, unless you have the rare case where you're on a program and you're having the opportunity to present the counterpoint. But generally, you're being shouted down. I imagine there's a lot of trolls online, and I would imagine that some of your core fan base has split, because there are those who say, you know what, can you just stick with my health and my food and the anti-carbs? I really liked it when you stayed in that lane. I'm very uncomfortable with you in the COVID lane. How have you balanced that? And as you think about managing your brand versus managing your principles, how have those two competed over the last 7 months?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. So early on, I think you had people getting really outraged because they wanted to panic and they believed the narrative and they got annoyed. And I think they drifted away. But the point was, again, it's about principle. All of that brand stuff just had to take a back seat. Doesn't matter, because what's happening is too important profoundly. And I have 5 children. Like, this is beyond that stuff. So I basically just largely ignored that problem. And as it happened, bizarrely, I began to get a new following, obviously, because a lot of people around the world are very concerned about this. So I actually increased my followers hugely, which I wasn't even thinking of. But it's a shame for the people who went away. But I think quite a few of them, people in the low carb movement, they're pretty clever. And the thing about them is they've been burnt already and they know about the big lie. They know the enormous lie about cholesterol we mentioned earlier, the lie about healthy, real foods with high fat. We were lied to, and they kind of created with their lies diabetes epidemic. So a lot of low carb people have already been through that process of realizing, which was hard for me back in 2012. I began to realize, my God, they've kind of been lying for decades. And it was hard for me to accept that. But a lot of low carb people have been through that process. So it's a little easier for them now to look around, see what's happening and realize, it looks like pharma has a big hand in this one. I mean, look at the media. WHO are in with pharma, in with foundations. WEF want a great reset. They've said that coronavirus is a huge opportunity. A quick Google on their website, you're talking about ultra rich individuals with nearly every corporate in the world engaged in that organization. And you begin to say, oh, this is like cholesterol and fat on steroids. People are, so I think quite a bit of the following is savvy enough to actually at first think, oh, Ivor is saying this is not that bad, but it is. But as time goes on, they begin to realize, okay, so it looks like Ivor's right again.
So let's talk about the big lie in the food industry. And it is interesting, as along all the recommendations, as I understand it, you know better, you're the expert, but obesity and diabetes is strongly related as a comorbidity to COVID deaths. And yet it's amazing to me that during the lockdown, as an example, we kept McDonald's open, or we kept Taco Bell open, or we didn't recommend that everyone exercise and lose weight, or that we didn't ban alcohol and cigarette consumption during the time. The number of times I would see people come out of a Starbucks with their mask on, pull it down, drink their 1,400 calorie venti frappuccino with whipped cream, and then light a dart. And no word of a lie, once a woman turned to me and she goes, "You have to put your mask on." And I was like, "But you're I couldn't even retort. So as we think about the food industry and the choices that were made, very clearly healthy choices that could have been made during a lockdown were not encouraged. We still don't hear people saying exercise every day. We still don't hear about people having a body mass index of less than 30, and if you did something, you would be better. How do you think about the food industry's big lie, and how do you get the word out in terms of healthy life and being better for your body and everything that your core brand stands for?
Yeah, so you know what? Funny enough, early on, I saw the newspaper articles coming out, and I thought, oh, here we go again. And this is way back, like in April. There were a lot of media articles about you can't boost your immune system. Diet has nothing to do with your immune system. So it was like, it wasn't just that they weren't promoting, diet and health, which makes an enormous difference to your immune system functionality. They were saying the opposite. So I noticed that and I'd see all these articles and then, oh my God, here we go. So they're debunking that diet's important. And like you say, they went ahead and all the corporates did great. The Walmarts, the junk food chains, they were all open. Amazon boomed. Whole ton of corporates boomed. Who got absolutely smashed? I know people who nearly went under. Artisan food producers, small businesses, small stores. They all got a hammering. But the big corporates all had a great time. So I think that speaks to as well that the drivers behind this whole madness are conflicted in certain ways. The thing about the immune system, insulin resistance, leptin resistance is what I've been going on about for 6, 7 years. It's not the whole cause of chronic disease, but it's the elephant in the room. It's the quarterback. It's the big one. And you can fix insulin resistance largely for most people and even put diabetes type 2 in remission for most people within a matter of literally days and weeks. I mean, it's not like a year-long campaign. I know people who've dropped their glucose below diabetic levels literally within days and insulin within a week. So insulin resistance, leptin resistance. Leptin is a cytokine. It's intimately involved in the immune system. If you're leptin resistant, running high leptin, you're going to get the worst of both worlds. You're not going to effectively respond to coronavirus infection, and you're going to accelerate the cytokine storm, the overreaction of the body that actually kills most people is the overreaction. So without getting into too much detail, I have a podcast with Dr. Ron Rosedale, who 25 years ago discovered the importance of leptin and insulin in disease, along with Dr. Eads and some others. And I interviewed him in April 9th, way back. And he was in India. And he's taken there by one of the richest Indian people, one of these mega rich guys, to help with the diabetes disaster. So we talked about all this on April 9th. And we all agreed within days you can drastically reduce your reaction to a coronavirus infection. All you do is eat meat, fish, eggs, and some vegetables. Just eat real food, no processed food. And within days, your diabetes level, your insulin resistance is going to tumble. With it, your leptin, your adiponectin will go up. The whole system will become vastly more capable. And it could be the difference between getting mild symptoms and getting a severe dose. For other people who are more ill, it could be the difference between, ICU and death, or a bad dose and ICU. But of course, you're right. No one was interested. In fact, if you just take an example of vitamin D, the FDA sent injunctions in the summer to websites to take down pages that were discussing vitamin D and COVID, not selling products, discussing that it may be important, which we know it is. So the whole system didn't just not push for physical health to help mitigate this problem enormously. They didn't just not push for it. Many aspects of the system actively fought against the very idea that you could help yourself.
So how does that not make you a real cynic? I mean, you've had to live with 8 years, 10 years plus of seeing scientific data, studying it, coming up with something that will truly make people healthier and having it fought at every turn. You talk about insulin resistance. Can you explain a little bit more about what that is and why people wouldn't just embrace it? I mean, you're telling me I can eat meat and eggs and fish and vegetables and feel better in 5 days and be more resistant to COVID? I mean, that's something everyone on the planet can do.
Absolutely. But no one will because no one's telling them. But yeah, so insulin resistance it's the most common kind of pathological state or disease state in the world. So insulin resistance kind of is type 2 diabetes, is pre-diabetes. There's lots of names, but it's all type 2 diabetes. So you might not be diagnosed yet because your blood glucose looks okay. But if you measure many people, millions, tens, hundreds of millions of people, if you measure their insulin, you find out their insulin is way above evolutionary levels. So they're effectively type 2 diabetic, but it's just that their body has not gone so out of control that it loses control of the glucose levels. That's the late step. So insulin resistance is the big one. And to give you an idea, around 70% plus of adult Americans over 45 years old are insulin resistant type 2 diabetic if you measure them properly. And that's going from official government figures, pre-diabetes and diabetes, which is all the insulin resistance, is 64%. And we kind of know if you measure with insulin measurements, not just glucose, you'll find the others. So it's massive. And the beauty is it's immediately addressable. Because if you stop what's driving the resistance to insulin in your body, the body actually corrects itself pretty well, very fast, like we said. And the problem is the foods that drive higher insulin chronically. And the simple way I always have of putting it, not to get into all the superfoods and the best foods, organ meats are the superfoods, by the way, sugar, refined carbs, refined grains, and vegetable oils, these seed oils, vegetable oils. That's the devil's triad. So a mixture of those will drive insulin resistance, diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's, many of the solid tumor cancers, endometrial, breast cancer, very dependent on insulin resistance. So all these chronic diseases, they're the three. And the problem with ultra processed food and junk food is not really that it has E numbers. Remember those? Or additives, or even probably GMOs. The problem is it's mostly made up of sugars, refined grains, and seed oils because they cost nothing. They're dirt cheap. Add in flavorings, you make food that costs nothing. And food companies now, I think the price of food, the ultra processed foods, the biggest single cost is advertising. You know, the cost of raw materials is nearly nothing. These are businesses. So they're the three. And if you cut out sugars, refined carbs, or grains and vegetable oils, by definition, you'll have to cut out ultra processed foods and most packet foods and supermarket foods. If you did that, whatever's left you can eat. It's as simple as that. But what's left is real food, like meat, fish, eggs, and vegetables. So if I were to keep it simple for someone, I'd just tell them, okay, you remove that, and then, to be honest, eat whatever you want.
So what does your family eat? I mean, the complaint I hear about food and diet in my book that I wrote called What the Fuck is Wrong with Everybody Else, What They Didn't Teach You in Business School. Chapter 1 is called Losing Weight, and it's only 8 words. It says, eat less, exercise more. Yes, it is that easy. Now, that's obviously a little bit of an exaggeration, but you and I both know if we eat less, exercise more, generally there are health impacts because you're making better choices. What does your family eat? How do you manage the difficulty of avoiding processed foods? What does the menu planning look like? How do you push back to people who say, you know, it's just too hard for me to watch what I eat and what I put in my body?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I have kids and they want to sneak stuff and all and treats, and it is tough. But we do just keep a system. Back when I discovered all of this, we got rid of all the fruit juices from the house because we used to drink a lot of those. It's just pure sugar. And we got rid of all the cereals, refined grain cereals from the larder, because they were a staple in the morning. So just by removing that stuff, and the kids weren't happy with it, but they got used to it. And we just made sure there's meat, cheese, eggs, and lots of other things available. But they still want the bad stuff. Of course they do. So you try and keep them educated, and you make sure you do one proper meal a day that's home cooked with real food, like meat, fish, eggs, and, you know, vegetables, and make sure they eat it. So at least they get that nutrition. Also, there's other little tricks as well, separate, like, you know, vitamins, minerals, very important that the foods don't have as much anymore. So we put magnesium into stews, magnesium citrate, so the whole family kind of keeps up to date on that most crucial one. So we do a little bit of that, but mostly it's the big meal and packed lunches to try and make them real food. And then the cheating, you say, well, okay, that's a fact of life, but we just try and keep them on track. And, yeah, people find it difficult. That's why we wrote the book, because we have a chapter on the psychology as well. It's not just the food, but if you switch to the real food and you realize you can enjoy that juicy ribeye now with no guilt, there are, like you mentioned a few minutes ago, being able to eat these things that were supposedly bad for you, but now you realize they're not. It does give you something back when you take away the junk, but it is difficult. You need a week or two in, and then you feel the enormous benefits, and that gives you motivation. But I would say to people, there's so many humans. It takes a while to develop a habit. You need to understand as well the technology. So if you understand what that cross-on is doing, and it's going in and it's releasing insulin, and it's going to your liver and it's making fat, and you view that as like, that helps you, understanding what it does in the body. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I'd always say, join a group. There is nothing as powerful as being in a Facebook group, telling people your challenges, being motivationally spoken to by real people, not some paid expert. So I'd say that could really help people as well. I always give that advice, and just explain to them that, habit forming, what you're doing is you have to psychologically look at it as a whole change in your lifestyle for a happier, healthier you with a longer life, and your last 20 years being way more productive. It's a huge prize. Your mental acuity will rise. You'll look better. You'll feel better. You'll have lower bills in the dentist and the doctor. There's so many benefits. You got to keep them in your head, and you got to keep focused on them. And you've got to see it as a lifestyle change, not a diet thing. Ideally get into the idea, if I'm going to make sure I get magnesium and, ultraviolet exposure for nitric oxide, I'm very conscious of how bad those foods they are. So if I have some when I'm drunk, the next day I'll go, whoa, that was bad, but it's okay. I'm going to get back on track. A whole lifestyle change, a whole change to your way of living and your future, productivity and mental health and physical health. Don't think of it as, I'm going to go on this diet, because going on this diet at some point fails.
Where do you
rant? Sorry.
No, it was a great rant. Where do you put exercise versus food? Go.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I know I focus mainly on food because we have a kind of a phrase, you can't outrun a bad diet. Like, you got to get your diet right. That's just an absolute pivotal, central plank. The exercise in the book, we did a chapter on it, and we tended towards the resistance training, to failure. So not huge weights, but doing this kind of routine where you do virtual skip rope to warm up, and then you do press ups to failure, and then squats to failure, and then lift ups to failure. And if you have a bar, then the chin ups. And that kind of covers your body weight exercises to failure, because the science is pretty clear now that if you do a routine like that to failure with many muscles, it triggers the signal to build more muscle. And that's what you want. And it can be very efficient, and you can do it in front of the TV, and it can be just 20 minutes, 2 or 3 times a week, and you get great results combined with your good food. Whereas marathon running suits some people and big runs, but don't know if it's quite as beneficial. So the two together, we always say, are synergistic. If you're only going to do one thing, if you know you're only going to do one thing, well, then the diet is, you just gotta fix the food. But you add in the exercise synergistically together, and you're just going to feel like $1 million. I mean, it is fantastic. So yeah, and fasting is the other one. It sounds kind of funny, but if you combine a low carb diet with just skipping the occasional meal, which will be much easier to do now. Once you're on low carb for a couple of weeks and you adapt, skipping meals gets really easy. And that saves you money. It saves you time. It's very good for your health, skipping the odd meal. And also it pushes you a little more towards ketogenesis, which is a good thing. I don't believe people need to all go keto, ultra low carb, and eat sticks of butter and nothing, no carbs. That's not a good keto. But doing a healthy low carb real food diet and then skipping meals occasionally will push you towards the very low carb keto, very healthy way to do it. So yeah, the combination, if you can combine a few of the modalities, you're just going to not believe the transformation in your life, you know?
So if you could skip a meal, the saying I've always heard is breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And I'm curious. I know, I love that you're laughing at that. That's great. What would you say to that wisdom, which probably is related to cereal manufacturing, and they're the ones who created that?
There's a long history to that. And actually, it did go back a bit to a scientific misunderstanding from type 1 diabetes. And the problem was, of course, if you had big meals or skip meals, your blood sugar would go crazy in your insulin dosing. So a belief was built in the diabetes world that eating a little and regularly was better. But that was for type 1 diabetics. Now, type 1 diabetics, if they eat a low carb, high protein diet, like Dr. Bernstein's type 1 diabetic diet, they will just dramatically reduce their insulin needs, and they can eat whenever they want because they're going to be eating not carbohydrate. But we'll put that aside. So it came from mistaken science from one narrow disease field. And then the breakfast manufacturers, of course, Kellogg and all of that stuff they created the marketing myth. So it is true that if you are diabetic eating bad foods, sugary carbs, that eating in the morning, it'll be slightly less bad for you. But that's only relevant again for a narrow group. In general, I'd say the best thing to do for most adults, you know, a little bit of a tummy, whatever, is to do 16-8 or 24. So 24 is 20 hours not eating. And that sounds crazy. But what you do is, say you have your meal at 6 p.m., big meal. The next day you skip breakfast and you eat at lunch or say 1 or 2 p.m. That's it. You eat a proper evening meal and you skip breakfast. And some people prefer to do the kind of 16-8 thing where they have the breakfast, but they skip the lunch and they have the evening meal. But either way, you skip one meal, you're down to 2 good whole food meals. And after you adapt to it, you won't have a second thought. You get your lunch hour back to get more work done, whatever. You don't have to do a breakfast in the morning. You know, you can focus on other things.
And you would do that. You would do that every day. Is the 24 or 16-8? Is that a everyday thing, a 4 time a week thing? What is that?
I do 24, and often the lunch, I'll just grab bits of cheese and cured meat from the fridge. So I won't even make up a huge lunch, or a tin of tuna or sardines. Just something if you feel peckish. But then mainly it's the main meal. And to be honest, a lot of days I do 24. So I basically have one meal a day, OMAD. And that actually seems to suit me. So the last 2 days, and today will be the same, I will not eat all day until around 6, 7 p.m. and the same the following day. I mean, I think I'm 4 days in a row now, including today. And I'm not saying people should do that. It suits me perfectly. I mean, it's real hunter-gatherer stuff. This is how we evolved. You know, you got up and you might not have much food, and you go out, and if you're lucky that evening, you can put on a nice pot.
Where does booze, if at all, fit in that? I know a lot of people like the wine, they like the whiskeys, they like the Guinness. What would you say to that in terms of a lifestyle choice?
Yeah, I'd say do as I say, not as I do. I like wine. I know it's healthier not to drink a lot of wine with your evening meal, but I do it. But it's a free world. I make the choice. And I kind of am honest about this, just like I'm honest with people that I do occasionally cheat, but I don't advise it because I can do it. Not to be arrogant, but I can do it and I know what I'm doing. Okay, I do it. I'm stressed out. I've been working hard. I do it. But then I don't do it after that. Whereas for some people, it's a slippery slope, like cigarettes. You know, you have one or two and bang, you got a pack in your pocket. So it's a tricky thing. But in alcohol, yeah, I love wine. I always did. And it's the one thing I do allow myself. And I think if you're eating a low carb diet with meat, fish and eggs and some vegetables, and the diet's really good, you have a lot more tolerance of say drinking wine without it having a negative effect. The real killer for most people would be to eat a poor diet and add excessive alcohol on top of it, because essentially they both go to the liver, and there's different biochemical processes, but drinking alcohol is kind of like taking sugar. The liver has to process it. It brings in a lot of energy per gram. It's very easy to get a lot of calories in. So it's not ideal. It's something to take under advisement, got to be careful.
I like it.
Most carnivores and purists pretty much don't drink. I've met them all over the world. Hardcore low carbers and carnivore and keto people, broadly speaking, don't drink because they're so focused on health. And they're not wrong. It's ideal to only have a very occasional drink. But you make your choices.
Exactly. Now, I wanted to pivot back to coronavirus one last time before we close, and I ask you a question. You had talked about excess deaths, and I thought that was a really, when we look back on 2020, the best way that we'll be able to assess how truly deadly coronavirus was in all these countries was to look at an average run rate of deaths in a country and then compare the deaths that we had. And one of the concepts that you talked about was this excess deaths. And some of the countries that had huge spikes had been running a mortality that was much, much lower coming into this. And so there was a lot of dry tinder. I'm curious if you would expand on that concept a little bit and how people could spend a little bit more time focusing on that, because life expectancy is a thing, and I come across as callous, and I never mean to, but like the average human lives to 80, and so if you live to 85, you should be very, very blessed, and you're gonna die of something, whether it's coronavirus or flu. And if people have been living longer for previous 3 or 4 years, it stands to reason that a superbug of some kind would take them down. Talk to me about the excess deaths philosophy that you have and created and built a video on that's on our website.
Yeah, well, David, it's a crucial concept, and just in terms of that age and when you die, we're all going to die. I mean, I don't fear death. I hope I'll live reasonable time. So if people should go into a room and they should close the door, quiet room, and sit and just think about something. The average age of death generally for most countries for coronavirus or COVID-19 deaths is higher than the average life expectancy. And just think on that and contemplate and internalize and let it settle in and say that is our epidemic. It's dying a little older than the average age of death when you have this problem. Now, I know there's younger people, but people need to internalize that. And then we take the dry tinder is not my phrase. Some people don't like it, but it was a research team who chose, it's a good name, but it sounds callous. But we just used it because we kept referring to the research published papers. So basically, take Sweden as an example versus the Nordics. So if you take Finland and the other Nordic, was it not
Norway?
Norway and Finland.
Yeah.
So they're classic cases. So if you looked at their death rates in the last 2 years and right up to March 2020, their death rates are normal. And then when COVID hits, they get a little bump. If you look at Sweden, there's a dramatic contrast. In 2019 respiratory season and right through 2020 up until March.
I think I have that up here. I may have stolen it from your presentation. I did a little snip because I really did want to talk to you about this.
Perfect. Yeah. So on Sweden there, you can see Finland, Norway are just bumbling along. And a country generally, with nearly no exception, like Germany, if it's bumbling along and people are dying during respiratory seasons and dying when they're going to normally die, you tend not to get hit by corona too hard. But Sweden, you can see, had a trough. So that's a year and a half there. That's nearly 2 full respiratory seasons. Respiratory seasons are where people die, overwhelmingly, aged and all. But they had a trough. It's almost like they did too good a job on protecting their elderly in the last 2 years or looking after them. But it really might have been other dynamics. The flu didn't really establish there. whatever. But you can see the trough. And actually, Sweden's hit over and above the Nordics that everyone talks about. It's to do with lockdown. It's nothing to do with lockdown. There's around 15 factors. But the big one is this, that their hit roughly matches their trough. So they have this huge store of very aged, frail people that normally would have died over the previous 18 months, but they didn't. You can see the trough. What happens then when a really tough, bad flu-like virus comes along, like SARS-CoV-2? It doesn't take an Einstein to figure out what's going to happen. You're going to get a massive correction. It's going to hurt. That was Sweden. Nothing to do with lockdowns. And another point is that Sweden, when you do a lockdown or not a lockdown, like Sweden decided end of March, we're not doing a lockdown. Other Nordics said we're going to do a lockdown because everyone else is. Well, it takes around 3 weeks or 25 days maybe after that decision for you to affect the death curve, because people would understand there's a lag. If you lock down today, you'll stop infections in the coming days, and in 3 weeks you'll begin to see less death. That's accepted scientifically. 4 weeks nearly. Sweden, when they lock down, if you go out the 24 days to where you can begin to see a difference in mortality,
You
guess
said
what?
Sweden. Did you mean Sweden? You said when Sweden locked down? Okay.
Well, sorry. When Sweden chose not to lock down, the other Nordics did. So let's say it was March 22nd. Sweden didn't lock down, the others did. Now you need to look 24 days later and say, well, what do they look like from then on? But when you do that, you see Sweden already, long before the 24 days, was miles up in the air with mortality, way above the others, which could not have been to do with their decision. So there's an elegant mathematical proof that Sweden's lockdown was not, or lack of lockdown was not the factor, because the death in Sweden was way up ramping above the others before the decision could even have an effect. So, like, there's so many ways of looking at this. The prior season mathematics, what I just said, mathematics. We have the data now, and there's 15 published papers or more that have analyzed and said lockdown does not correlate with deaths per million across the countries. It's a fact. It's not modeling. You know, it's effectively a fact. Nothing is proven 100%. Even in the Lancet journal, a published paper in late June, said there is no connection between mortality in a country and whether they lock down hard, middle, or nothing. It's published. But to our earlier point about the narrative, no one cares. No one cares about the science and the reality. There's a narrative, and whether it's through madness or whether it's through conflicts of interest where people have stated that this is a huge opportunity, this corona thing, or a mixture of all, it doesn't matter. No conspiracy theory. There's some conspiracies, there's some stupidity, there's some groupthink, there's some, to be quite frank, mass psychosis in this as well. So it's a big melting pot of bad things are driving this bus. But the science has answered the questions quietly in the background. No one cared.
Do you think this vaccine, so we've seen Moderna came out today and said that they have a vaccine that's 94% effective. Pfizer had one that came out last week, 90% effective. Do you think that this, Dr. Fauci, who is the most controversial character in the United States, said, well, even with the vaccine, social distancing and masks probably don't go away. I'm curious if you think the vaccine plus more time plus the end of winter gets people back to the place of principles, or how you see the vaccine changing things. And I'm curious, just as an interest, are you planning on taking the vaccine?
Yeah. So Fauci, I don't know. I won't even say anything about him because he just horrifies me. I mean, literally horrifies me. Like some terrible figure from the past and history, you know, terrifying figures. So that's what I think about him. And I've talked to the Fauci of Europe, Emeritus Professor of Immunology, Beda Stadler, who has met him many times. Beda Stadler says the exact opposite as him. on every single point. And I'll tell you, Bede is correct. I interviewed him in Bern in Switzerland a couple of months ago. So the problem with the vaccine is you say 90%, say 95%. What does that mean? So in the case of the Pfizer, they got 45,000 people who are not aged. They were not particularly old or anything. So you're not even in the group of interest. That's a problem. The criteria for success were to alleviate symptoms somewhat in any manner. That was it. Nothing about death, nothing about transmission, nothing about anything important, nothing about anything that would make you want to take the vaccine or not. The criteria were alleviating symptoms. So basically it's judging it like an aspirin. Essentially, that's it. So they got like 0.4% got infected, I think, or 1 in 250. So you got this small number of people out of 45,000, and you were 90% less likely to have, 90% less likely to have symptoms of a certain level, which they have not told us. So you may have had 2 sneezes instead of 5 by having the vaccine. You may have had, a slightly sore throat instead of a very sore throat by taking the vaccine. But you can see where I'm going with this, and it's not anti-vax. The criteria for that trial were you could pass them with flying colors with a worthless product. So what can you say about it? I mean, there's no secrets here. This is published. It's symptom alleviation, which is subjective. So that's the other thing. It's not even like, well, it's not this person died and didn't die. Obviously, none of that. It's not infectivity or transmissibility, which you'd be interested in if the vaccine stopped it transmitting. That's not it. It's just there's less symptoms with the vaccine. So it doesn't mean anything really, because how long is a piece of string? Do you vaccinate everybody because it's 2 sneezes versus 7? No. So tell me more. You better tell me how much better the vaccinated were. And hopefully it's a sneeze versus an ICU for 3 weeks. But it's not that. It's not any of that. So this is the absurd thing. I saw the criteria for the trial months ago, and I said, but sure, this is a pointless trial. It doesn't mean anything, really. So that's the problem. So you say, would I take it? Would I take it for a disease where I have effectively a 0 chance of being affected? And I did have it, by the way, back in March, and I worked through it as it happened. I know for some people it's terrible, and for aged people and immunocompromised, it can mean death. But the reality is, for me and all my family, it just means nothing. And I know that the vaccine is largely agreed on not affecting transmissibility. So I know I'm not helping anyone else by taking the vaccine. So if I'm not helping myself in any way, and I'm not helping anyone else either, why would you take it? I mean, because you like drugs?
Well, and that comes back to, I think, the overarching point which you said about food, which is where we started, and the great lie and the great pharma and the great corporations. And I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist because it is a weaponized word, but in my life, I probably drink too much, but I don't take drugs. I don't take aspirin. I don't go to the doctor. I don't take flu medicine. I drink Gatorade if I feel like get the flu because I'm dehydrated. I go to bed. My wife calls me a baby, and then I eventually get out of bed and carry on with my life. But it just seems like when you say the criteria of this, and I hadn't read the full study because it's not my expertise. I'm more of the data guy, and it's very hard to pull the data out. Every time I see deaths or if I see the vaccine, I'm like, okay, so what was the age range of the people? And then did you expose them to a whole bunch of sick people? Did we take 45,000 people, give them the vaccine, have them go in a room with people who coughed on them, and then saw if you could get infected? And if they couldn't get infected, that seems like that would be a useful vaccine. But the way you described it, you basically, I coughed 2 less than 5. No one died because it's a very, very low fatality to generally healthy people. I mean, that does sound very useless. And yet the capital markets, the governments, the politicians, everyone is singing the praises of this amazing medical accomplishment, which it just feels wrong.
It's theater, and it's a theater. It's an important part of the narrative, and the narrative now, they're painted into a corner that, until the vaccine. There's been a lot of that talk. We're stuck until the vaccine. So they're not going to admit what I just told you, but that's from the company itself. I think they were pressured to come out with data. It's very hard to get the data. And even when it comes out, then it's what I told you. So no, they had to, one of the vaccine companies, because in England, the problem had kind of gone away. They had to go to Brazil to find people who would actually have coronavirus in the next few months, because they couldn't do a trial in England because it's gone away. Now that tells you a lot. If you can't test your medication because no one has the disease anymore, you got to ask yourself what you're doing. But they don't care. So yeah, 45,000. No, there's no active infections. There's no testing of that. It's just wait and see who gets it and how their symptoms are. And they have not given, when I say 2 sneezes, 7, I'm making a kind of joke about it because I can't get the data on those symptoms, just that it was better with the vaccine. And it's not transmissibility, it's not death, and it's not serious complications. It's nothing that matters for a vaccine you're going to push out to the population. It's just symptoms. And it's subjective because, I guess it was blinded, so no one knew who got the vaccine and didn't, but actually it might be difficult to blind. I would worry about blinding as well, that they may have known, okay, you got the vaccine, and are you sure your throat was really sore? Maybe not, it wasn't too bad, was it? No, I guess it wasn't that bad. I'm having fun now. And then the guy who didn't get the vaccine, I had a bit of a sore throat. Yeah, but was it sore? Was it really sore? Yeah, it's pretty sore, severe sore throat. I don't know, but this stuff is not science. It's not science. It's, I don't know, it's industry. It's, I don't know, marketing. And that's what I perceive, because if they don't give you the data, and what they do give you points to what I said, they're going to give you the best data they have. You know that. They're going to give you the best, most impressive data. And what they put out was just laughable. So that's all they got.
So it's actually, if I tie all that together, and it's something I hadn't thought about before, because of exactly what you said, that it's a season. And in the summer, except in the US, where even the influenza is bimodal because it's more tropical in the south, which makes sense, and less in the north, and then you move, so you basically sent 45,000 participants into the US at a time when it really wasn't going around. And so even getting people infected was going to be extraordinarily difficult, and presumably the same way that the flu, if you get the flu in the summer, I assume people do, why would it not be severity-wise? Why would a flu in the summer be less bad than the winter? Why does the flu recede during the summer versus the winter? How does that season, what is it about the cold weather that seems to expand the flu or coronavirus?
Yeah, well, it's not just temperature. It's temperature, humidity, and human vitamin D levels and immune function, which are tied to the seasons. So no one's fully worked it out. A big hitter would be when the sun and UV exposure gets on your skin, you create vitamin D and nitric oxide, which is very important in these things. And humans are just more robust during the summer. So that's one reason for the flu having less impact. You'll still find it, but it doesn't do much, So that's the whole UV, vitamin D kind of thing. And then there's humidity. Again, there's some conflicting data, but, certain environments of low relative humidity, like in winter when we're indoors, and outside it's damp and cold, but indoors, because of heating we all have now, you get a very low relative humidity, and that's bad. Or anyway, either way, it's that living indoors. And then there's temperature as well, but there's problems with that as well, because we've got very hot countries that are hit like a hammer, like Peru, with a huge hump in their season. That doesn't link to temperature. So it's a mixture of all of those, and maybe even more profound things. Like viruses are so complex. I'll give you an example. Influenza has pretty much walked off the stage this year, and it's not due to the lockdowns and masks, right? Because rhinoviruses have kept going. But influenzas are very close to coronaviruses in the family. I didn't know this till a few weeks ago. I thought of them as very different. They're actually quite similar in many ways. So the influenzas have gone west. And in the 1960s, there's many publications on this. There was an influenza strain that had been around for decades. It was the quarterback. And a new one came in and caused a bit of a hit because it was a genuine new, different influenza. And guess what happened? The one that had been there for decades, suddenly they couldn't find it, and they've never seen it since. So that'll give an idea to people the complexities in here, seasonality, viruses interacting in the host, so some other viruses literally disappear, they stop activity. But to get back to your question, yeah, you go through the summer, there's lots of reasons you're not going to have any action, but you're trialing a vaccine. So you're going to find mostly mild symptomatics. And that's why I think they put in the criteria. They just have to see symptoms less because they knew that's all they're going to get. Now, some people would say we can't do the trial because no one's going to be impressed by this. Come on, they're not stupid. But obviously they thought we are stupid.
Wow.
I mean, it's.
If you could go back to your younger self, you met yourself 20 years ago before, and maybe you have the knowledge now around health and eating better and just life. What advice would you give yourself 20 years ago that would have helped maybe accelerate your journey to where you are today? And it could be business advice, it could be food advice, it could be building a brand advice. You've had a very interesting career, certainly post writing the book, and the brand, the elevation of this Fat Emperor brand and everything that you're doing. So I'm curious what advice you would give yourself.
Yeah, it's tricky. But one part of me would say that for all the hard-ass corporate work I did and huge hours and pressure and stress, in a way it forged me. So you can look back on that and say, in some ways I needed all that before publicly being out to be attacked, like in the last 7 or 8 years. I mean, just to give an example, 7 or 8 years ago when I first went out with videos, I used to wake up at night thinking I've just claimed that statins are largely ineffective and, the fat cholesterol, and everyone's arguing, vegans are arguing, what if I'm wrong? I had this obsession. What if I'm wrong? I'm publicly out there. It's very hard to get used to. But then I got harder and harder and harder through the experience of being exposed. And now a week ago, there was a full page in Ireland's top Sunday business broadsheet. And it basically was largely attacking me, right? And I enjoyed it. So that's the transformation, the extent of it. But to go back to your question, yeah, I kind of needed to go the way I went. I always had technical truth as a priority. I would twist things, manipulate stuff, everyone does. But technical truth, I would always insist on getting to the bottom of the issue and representing it and resolving it fast. And that's paid off for me. Now, I'm going to have to get to your question though. What advice would I have? I was probably too focused on what other people think. And now I'm completely free. I'd love if I earlier had trusted my own counsel more and less worried about what people think. Take on board what they say. Very important. Analyze it, but just take your self-esteem and your self-judgment away from what they say. Just analyze it. So now I know it's hard to do. I'm trying to think, is there a glib one I could have done different? Certainly on the health. If I had have only known what I know now, I could be in incredible shape. Because if I knew in my 20s that food was vitally important, and magnesium and potassium and selenium and all these things, I would have been motivated as a technical person. I would have been conscious, and I would have actually eaten far fewer takeaways, all that rice, sauces, orange juice. I ended up in 2012, like in the doctors with sky high enzymes, and I was drinking orange juice by the liter or by the quart. Imagine I had 20 years if I had known what I know now that's in our book. If I'd known it, I could have probably done a lot for my father. He had heart attack at 66, vascular dementia, terrible last few years, died at 72. I was with him on my own in the middle of the night when he died. And I know now from my knowledge, he had diabetes in his mid-40s. He was on multiple blood pressure meds. He was diabetic. But he had no idea. He was avoiding fat. He was eating margarines. You know, these margarines which are poisonous. And he used to always have toffee sweets. You know, toffees, chewy toffees, in his car. And he had a long commute. But you could say, oh, well, that's silly. Sweets are bad for you. They never told him that. No one ever said sweets really or sugar was bad. It was all the fat. So he used to cut the fat off his bacon. You know, I go back further. I could have explained. He was a technical man. He was a manager and a very technical man. If I had told him what I knew, he would have went, whoa. You know what I mean? Like, oh, if only we knew.
I think that's great advice, especially as it comes to health and mortality, and to put it in the context of what you could have impacted the life of your father and the productivity during the time. And I think that's part of the reason why your message around health and food and the importance. Now, is statin if I'm correct, it's some medication that reduces cholesterol. Is that am I correct on that?
Yeah, it lowers cholesterol, but its action probably isn't much to do with the lowering. And, you know, they have a beneficial effect, but they also have side effects. So they're oversold massively, I think, would be fair to say.
And the reason I raise it, and I won't, because I don't know what the product is, but I do have a friend whose business is to buy life insurance policies. And so one of the stats is something like 88% of people's life insurance policies that you get when you're 30 or 35, you pay into them, but then you, for whatever reason, you're running out of money near the end of your life, you stop paying them and then just turn them over to life insurance company who's now collected premiums forever and never has to pay you out. And it's something like 88%. So there's a business where you can buy life insurance policies from people who are near the end of their life, and then they get the money to do experimental treatments or travel or whatever. But because it's capitalist, they look at their medical records, and there are medicines that are prescribed by doctors that they have a short-term impact, but they know within 6 years they will develop Alzheimer's and dementia, and they will die prematurely. And so when they see those medicines that are prescribed by doctors, those are the ones they want because they know that they will get paid sooner. And I find it amazing, again, back to medicine, back to the big lie that's told, is there are people who can look at the data and who can find exactly the medicine that people are put on that is absolutely wrong for people, but we go down the medical path instead of the don't eat processed refined sugars, reduce your juice, exercise, eat eggs, meat, fish, and vegetables, and life will be better.
Yeah. Well, I'd say the slightest change towards the stuff we've been talking about, the right way to do it, not doing everything perfectly, the slightest shift towards that will match or beat the medications they have for chronic disease, whether blood pressure or statins. It's just a reality. And if you do it reasonably well, you'll blow away the benefit of medications. Not to say they don't do anything, the meds, but I've seen all the data. I mean, I used to joke, if you eat 1 or 2 less slices of bread a day, you'll beat most of the blockbuster drugs for chronic disease, because you'd have to do so little to improve your metabolic health to just match the effects that they have. It's kind of sad, really, but there you go. Yeah.
Well, we will leave it there. Ivor, I really appreciate you joining us and talking about this, because I think that it's nice to have a balanced, thoughtful discussion where you're also pointing people to go and do their own research, but to look at the data and question the narrative, because it's not necessarily a conspiracy theory when things don't actually make sense.
Investigative journalism, just like they used to do.
Well, best of luck. I will look forward to following you. I am going to make some changes to my diet as a result of this conversation, so I look forward to being sharper, smarter, and better looking in the next 30 days.
Hey, great stuff, David. Thank you very much.
Ivor, thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day.